Buying a vintage watch places a functional piece of mid-century design and mechanical history directly on your wrist. But the market itself is a zero-sum game. You are entering a space where expert sellers routinely turn a profit by offloading modified, poorly maintained junk onto uneducated beginners. It is incredibly intimidating to jump straight in, especially if you try to navigate the highest price tiers, like the complex Rolex market right out of the gate. You have to accept a central trade-off. To own that piece of history, you forfeit the out-of-the-box readiness and carefree durability of a modern watch. This is the true vintage budget equation. You allocate 70% of your cash to the watch itself, 20% to a mandatory initial service, and 10% for strops and tools. Surviving your first purchase requires shifting your mindset entirely. You cannot act like an eager consumer at a retail store. You have to think like a cautious archivist. Forget the idea of out-of-the-box reliability. Above all, never expose a newly purchased vintage watch to water. It comes down to simple physical chemistry. Over decades, internal rubber gaskets that seal out moisture dry up. They become completely brittle, snapping under the slightest pressure to instantly flood the movement. This leads to a non-negotiable rule of vintage ownership. Every single piece requires professional servicing within your first year of owning it. That servicing involves a watchmaker entirely disassembling the mechanical heart of your watch, cleaning it, oiling it, and putting it back together by hand. Expect this to cost between $150 and $350. Treat this as a mandatory tax on the purchase, not an optional upgrade. If you spend 100% of your budget on the sticker price, you will have no cash left to fix the watch when it stops ticking. You've just bought a very expensive paperweight. When you start looking at specific listings, your pre-purchase inspection should begin with a critical look at the case. Many buyers fall into the case diameter trap. Sellers list a horizontal measurement, like 34 millimeters across. But how wide a watch is fails to accurately predict how it will actually sit on a human wrist. The vertical distance from top to bottom is the lug-to-lug length, the true indicator of fit. Turned sideways, the internal movement dictates height. A manual wind has a slim profile. An automatic requires a weighted rotor, making it much taller. This changes your daily experience. A manual piece requires you to wind the crown by hand every day. An automatic winds itself using your arm's motion, but the thicker case may not slide easily under a shirt cuff. Prioritizing the vertical lug-to-lug length over the horizontal diameter is the only way to ensure you don't buy a watch that clumsily overhangs the edges of your wrist. Verifying a vintage dial's originality requires you to read the chemical signature of the luminous material, or lume, painted on the hands and markers. From 1963 to the late 1990s, the industry standard was a material called tritium. Over decades, authentic tritium naturally degrades and ages into distinct shades of warm caramel or brown. Authentic tritium ages unevenly. A split-screen comparison reveals a major red flag. If every lume plot is perfectly identical, it's proof the dial was repainted. This tampering immediately destroys its collector value. Another deal-breaker is finding bright white superluminova or blue chromalite on a watch from the 1960s or 70s. Those materials weren't even invented during that era. In the vintage market, uneven chemical decay is your proof of authenticity. Perfection is usually a lie. Once you know the watch is authentic, you need a strategy for wearing it daily without degrading its investment value. A significant portion of a vintage watch's value is tied to its original, period-correct steel bracelet. Immediately remove the original bracelet. Use a spring bar tool to pop it out safely and store it to preserve the original links from scratches. This is why you should look for watches with 18mm or 20mm lug widths. They offer the widest selection of aftermarket strap replacements. Swap in a secure fabric NATO strap or a leather option to handle the daily wear and tear on your wrist. Shelving the original steel bracelet locks in the watch's financial value, while an inexpensive aftermarket strap takes all the physical abuse. The volume of vintage brands can be paralyzing. This quadrant chart maps out a starting framework, weighing your budget and risk against horological heritage. If you are risk-averse and want to learn the ropes, start with the vintage Seiko 5 Sports Automatic. These watches were born out of massive, highly efficient factory production lines in Japan, rather than bespoke traditional Swiss craftsmanship. You sacrifice Swiss prestige, but for $50 to $150, you face zero financial risk securing a reliable in-house automatic movement. If you want tool watch history, like dive or aviation heritage, you move up to the Mito Ocean Star and the Enakar Sherpa series. These brands provide genuine Swiss engineering at a fraction of early Rolex prices. The trade-off is a smaller pool of replacement parts when service time comes around. Acquiring horological history doesn't require a massive budget if you map your goals correctly. For a buyer looking to optimize value and address sport watch, the 1950s to 1970s Omega Constellation is the top-tier beginner choice. This secures a COSC certified chronometer tested to an accuracy of -4 to +6 seconds per day, performance that matches or exceeds a Rolex Datejust costing significantly more. However, it demands the highest upfront budget on this list, pushing the limits of financial risk. Whatever tier you choose, the survival rules remain. Respect the mandatory service tax, prioritize lug-to-lug size, and reject perfectly uniform lume. Avoid the temptation of shiny, heavily polished bargains. Stick to these vetted brands, keep the gaskets dry, and protect your investment by embracing the archivist mindset.